Hey guys, my name is Zachary Baca, and I'm here to present on tetanus for Dr. Cody's microbiology class. Tetanus is caused by the bacterium Clostridium tetani, which is a gram-positive bacterium that forms subterminal endospores, meaning the endospores form on a single end of the bacterium, which causes them to appear drumstick-like, as you can see in the picture on the slide. And our book mentions that Clostridium endospores were able to be revived after being sealed in a test tube for 34 years. And I'll explain later why Clostridium tetani existing as endospores is significant in the pathogenesis of tetanus into the body. And Clostridium tetani is also anaerobic and is commonly found in soil, feces, and saliva. And generally, people associate rusty nails with the transmission of tetanus, but it's not actually the rust that acts as a fomite for tetanus, but if that rusty nail happens to be in a lot of soil, then it could potentially carry Clostridium tetani from being in contact with the soil. Tetanus is a non-transmittable disease and is commonly referred to as lockjaw. Pathogenesis of tetanus, the incubation period is in between 3 to 21 days, with 9 to 10 days being the average. It can enter the body through any type of abrasion or wound. Generally, people think of deep puncture wounds of the parenteral route with needles or thorns or nails, as I mentioned before. But it doesn't necessarily have to be a deep puncture wound. It could just be a small cut or burn, or even a bug bite, just anything to bypass the epidermis to allow the spores to enter into the bloodstream and the underlying tissue. Once the spores are in the tissue, they germinate from the anaerobic conditions and eventually lyse and produce two toxins. The two exotoxins that are produced are tetanolysin and tetanospasmin. Tetanolysin has no role in pathogenesis, but tetanospasmin is what produces the effects and symptoms of tetanus. Tetanospasmin is one of the most potent toxins known to man. 2.5 nanograms per kilogram of body weight is enough to make that toxin lethal to the human body. Tetanospasmin toxin travels from the tissue to the CNS via blood and lymph. There, the nerve cells take up the toxin by endocytosis at the neuromuscular junction, and the toxin is transported inside the axons. When it's inside the axons, it inhibits the release of inhibitory neurons such as GABA or glycine. As you can see in the picture on the slide, you have GABA there that's going to bind to the presynaptic neuron, but the tetanospasmin toxin does not allow that to happen. So the excitatory nerve impulses are unopposed, which causes that involuntary contraction and spasm of the muscles. Because the inhibitor neurons usually stop the muscle from contracting, but when those aren't functioning, then the muscle just constantly fires. Common symptoms of tetanus include muscle spasms, such as trismus, which is that jaw cramping, lockjaw, that happens from the spasm of the masseter muscles and the muscles surrounding the masseter muscle. Rhisis sardonicus is that sustained facial spasm that produces grinning, as you can see in the picture on the slide. Opsonothotinus is that back and neck arch from the muscle spasms in that area, as you can see in the infant on the screen. And other symptoms can be high blood pressure, fever, muscle stiffness, and seizures. And tetanus can become dangerous when these symptoms can cause complications such as a pulmonary embolism, which is a blockage of a lung artery, laryngospasms, which is that spasm of the vocal cord. As you can see in the picture, it closes the vocal cord, which can cause suffocation. And both these things, pulmonary embolism and laryngospasms, can ultimately lead to difficulty breathing and death. Bone fractures can take place from the severe muscle spasms, and pneumonia can also happen from the difficulty of swallowing, whereas the saliva drops down into the lungs and can cause infection. The four types of tetanus: you have generalized tetanus, which makes up about 80% of cases of tetanus, and the symptoms usually last 3 to 4 weeks, but can last several months, and it often starts with the lockjaw, trismus, and then proceeds to the stiff neck and difficulty swallowing, and then eventually to muscle spasms elsewhere in the body. You have localized tetanus, which is where the spasms are confined in an area near infection. About 15% of cases of tetanus are localized, but only 1% are fatal. It can happen to someone who's partially immune and can eventually progress to generalized, where it then becomes more dangerous. Cephalic tetanus is a type of localized tetanus in the cephalic region. It only has a 1 to 2 incubation period and only makes up 0.4 to 3% of all cases of tetanus. And it has a 15 to 30% fatality rate. And it involves the loss of function of a cranial nerve that could cause facial twitching. Neonatal tetanus is the last type of tetanus from an unhealed umbilical stump, usually cut with an unsterile instrument, and is very common in third world countries and can lead to lasting brain damage in the child. Historical perspective of tetanus. In 5th century BC, Hippocrates first described the clinical signs of tetanus. He was able to link someone with a cut or wound to having those symptoms of tetanus. In 1884, Carle and Raton first produced tetanus in animals by taking Clostridium tetani from a deceased human who had tetanus and then inserting it into the animals. That same year, Nicolier produced tetanus in animals by injecting them with samples of soil. So he was able, that was important because he was able to link soil as being a reservoir of infection for tetanus. And then in 1921, Ramon created a method for inactivating the tetanus toxin with formaldehyde. And this was extremely important in creating the vaccine that Descombe developed in 1924. And I'll explain why in the next slide, why that toxoid is significant. The CDC recommends that to get several tetanus vaccinations throughout one's life, and that's the best way to stay protected. The DTaP is given at 2 months, 4 months, 6 months, between 15 and 18 months, and between 4 to 6 years. And the Tdap is given between 11 and 12 years. And then every 10 years after, a TD booster is recommended by the CDC. And the DTaP and Tdap are combo vaccines that also vaccinate against pertussis and diphtheria. And the way the vaccine works, the spores are not actually, the cells itself are not actually injected into the human, but the toxoid is used, which is what Ramon discovered or created the method for inactivating that toxin to create the toxoid. And that is what's used. So the toxoid is basically then inactivated tetanospasmin that the body is then able to build up memory B cells against. If you do contract tetanus, a doctor may give you tetanus immune globulin, TIG, which helps neutralize that toxin, but it is only effective before the toxin reaches that neural tissue. So once the toxin reaches that neural tissue, TIG is not effective in neutralizing the toxin. So the toxin has to be, in the bloodstream or in that tissue before traveling to the CNS for TIG to be effective. The sedatives are given to deal with the muscle spasms to help control those, and then antibiotics are also given as well. Epidemiology of tetanus, there's 5 to 7% of neonatal deaths worldwide are from neonatal tetanus. But neonatal tetanus is very rare in the US. There's only been 2 cases since 1989. Most cases occur in children under 5 worldwide, and this accounts for 49% of the deaths from tetanus, because a lot of these third world countries are not able to provide the recommended vaccines throughout infancy and early childhood, and so almost 50% of the deaths worldwide are from children under 5 that aren't provided these vaccines. Tetanus is fatal in 11% of recorded cases, and it is most common in third world countries. The U.S. has only had 30 new cases each year. As you can see, the decline from 1950 in that top graph. And in the bottom graph, you can see from 2009 to 2015 that most of the people with tetanus in the United States that die from it are the elderly, because